Hello everyone, an interesting question and answer today. I'll keep it brief because, the question demands not to digress too much. Albeit there would be room for, for expansion in this regard. That is, say, while you're doing and re-uploading discussion of battles, would it be trouble for me to ask you about the Battle of Malplaquet? Not what happened per se, as that's not hard to find, but rather where the errors were made, what could have been done better in the battle, where battle should have taken place, whether the battle should have taken place. Here, I guess this is written with automatic corrector from the phone. If the location was an error to attack, full stop. Right, so there are two as you know, I don't make videos about modern age battles, at least up to this point. I've never done it so far, and I'd love to, actually, because I love that part of history. We talked about a little Prince Eugene and so on. So the question is very specific, though, and I appreciate the fact we were not to talk about the battle in general, but just whether things could be better from both sides. So there is also an intelligent distinction between the strategical and tactical dimension. So you know that the Battle of Malplaquet, for those who don't know, was essentially the bloodiest battle of the 18th century. Right, it was fought on September the 11th, 1709. It was part of the War of Spanish Succession, and it was essentially more like a World War I style carnage in a way. There were hundreds of thousands of soldiers confronting, and on the Franco-Belgian border, and the result was something like 35,000 casualties. Right, it was insane for many reasons at the time. Europe was shocked. There is all change that eventually such battles, just Blenheim and Ramillies-Oudenaarde, etc., and in fact Malplaquet itself, especially brought to probably the change of the military art during the 18th century, as this enormous masses of men were eventually shrunk to something more qualitative in nature towards the mid-18th century. Then things changed again, but it was one of those milestones in European military history that in fact at some point we'll have to analyze. Now, the situation here should be framed, there is essentially the French and the anti-French alliance quite concretely, and this was part of the Allied invasion of France, right, from the northeast, that was fundamentally halted by the French. The battle was, according to the military rules of the time, an Allied victory, but today it's fundamentally considered a French one, rather, because essentially after the important defeats that the Allies had scored in the previous years against the French army, the French managed essentially to withstand the Allied onslaught at Malplaquet, and to maintain cohesion, retreat in good order, and acquiring great spirit and reputation after that. So that the main purpose that was keeping, because of the Allies together, given the enormous costs that were very high from both sides, was the fact that France was apparently crumbling, and Villiers, the French commander-in-chief force, was fundamentally the only army between the Allies and Paris. So this is a battle of enormous significance, as you understand. The Allies, after this, went on besieging another stronghold, because here it was about essentially provoking the French, seizing the various strongholds at the border, but fundamentally also at some point pushing in to France herself. But the thing stopped there. At that point, after the battle, the main powers of the alliance thought rather to bail out. There were naturally many attritions. It was simply the fact that the Spanish succession, if Austria had clamorously won, it would have become the next problem for the other countries as well, not just for France. And the same goes with France itself. So it was, if you want, already a miracle of the fact that so many troops could be being brought together, and especially under such clamorous generals such as Marlborough and Prince Eugene. this enormous success in Italy, in Belgium, had been possible against the French army. It was, the most powerful in Europe. And fundamentally, from a strategical point of view, there were some missed opportunities where we're talking about some secondary aspects, right? Because the French here were suffering the following situation, that they were running short in supplies dramatically. France had witnessed a famine. There was essentially a problem properly in the organization of the French army, making the supplies arrive, but properly also the troops were somewhat dispersed or disorganized and not brought. It was difficult properly to put them together because of these logistical problems. And the Allies were now entering France, were about to enter France by, first of all, securing certain important strongholds on the Belgian-French frontier. So the first thing was, there were some strategical options, fundamentally. Villiers, we know it from his letters, feared essentially that the Allies would have essentially outflanked him in the west and passed from the sea up to Boulogne, and eventually from there entering Picardy, so simply passing him by, which might have been risky but feasible in a sense. The main problem of the French is that they, because of this supplies problem and broader confidence deriving from this, were quite cautious in the attack, and there were some opportunities lost by them. Right, the Allies actually operated in a in a sensible manner, and the French as well, but in the sense they were more limited and rightly, perhaps overly, justifiably or reasonably overly cautious by a certain standard. And Villiers especially had been entrenching in creating this line across the border, where he had placed his troops, where it was a very strong position that the Allies fundamentally had approached to properly test the resistance. This happened at La Bassette, right? And so that's what had happened. The Allies had marched from Ghent to La Bassette. It is essentially between Bethune and Douai, right? And they had tested. They would have liked to attack, because breaking the French at that point, the Allies had the upper hand morally at that point. They felt the strongest, confident, and therefore they were on the offensive, and their strategic objective was knocking out France, right? So they were active, but they had the initiative in this regard. Villiers wanted to maintain his own, to increase, to consolidate his own army, his own forces, waiting for reinforcement, for supplies, and so on. And in the meanwhile, essentially building these entrenchments that he was extending also towards the southeast. This, essentially between Bouchain and Valenciennes. And at that point, the Prince Eugene and Marlborough, having realized they couldn't really break through the French position, turned towards. They had two options actually: Ypres and Tournai. Villiers thought that Ypres would have been the next one, because it was, had kind of a less of a reputation as a fortress than Tournai. It was extremely strong, and those are areas in Europe where all battles or campaigns were fundamentally fought around the possession of these cities. But he was confident because he was well reinforced, well defended, and Villiers' objective was essentially to delay the Ally action in all this. So that was his goal: to buy time, delaying the enemy offensive, making it abort for that season, as far as France was concerned. At this point, armies, but by the bad season, eventually encamped themselves elsewhere. The strategic, the offensive were halted, and so on. So that would have bought France more time to reorganize, to reinforce, and that this is naturally what also the Allies were kind of trying to avoid, exploiting the moment of weakness, right? So Tournai was better, was a more imposing stronghold, but it was actually scarcely defended. In part, this was also Villiers' fault. They eventually, the decision was Marlborough wanted to go to Ypres and Prince Eugene to Tournai, and Prince Eugene's side won. And here you cannot say, well, okay, Villiers objectively feared the you have to always consider that there are political considerations also. What were the theaters that were more convenient for some of the allies and so on. Marlborough wanted to go west, and this is exactly what Villiers feared, right? And instead, we cannot say whether, let's say, that action would have been. We don't know. Like, it's unpredictable what the strategical consequences of that would have really been. So it's not really a mistake. On the contrary, Tournai was besieged, and even though with imposing amount of losses, 5,000 from the side of the Allies was taken, right? It was full of mines, it was a mess. The citadel held on, but it was taken relatively easily. So that it was a big deal, because now, that was one of the major strongholds, and the thing impressed very much the Saint-Villiers, who accused the local commander of having not organized the fortification, so the supplies in a fashion. Actually, the French resisted pretty hardly there, and the Allies' losses are proof of that. And at that point, Villiers thought still that the Allies would have gone to Ypres. That was, objectively, in fact, an Allied strategical objective, and he, was quite surprised when instead the Allied commanders headed towards Mons, right? That, if taken, would have objectively put most of the Netherlands at that point in the hands of the Allies, secured from French fort. And at that point, Villiers wrote to Louis XIV, who answered, "Yes, I give you full permission to attack." Right? It was the big deal, big risk, right? Because it says if Mons falls, it's over, because it means properly we can't defend anything, and the morale will collapse further, and our forces will perish anyway. So Villiers decided to march on Mons. This was a very bold but somewhat necessary move that was carried out while Villiers was still, because Louis XIV says whatever the cost, right? And the situation was dramatic in France, right? The Saint-Villiers had to take away literally, food from the mouths of the French. So it was a desperate situation, but he was, of course, obedient to Sun King. And advanced while still had to receive D'Artagnan reinforcements, further supplies, and all this. It was essentially a countermarch to beat in time the Allies that were marching toward Mons. And the Allies at that point didn't realize this. They didn't realize the French had moved en masse. Because you see, by the way, if Mons had fallen, like, the strategic deal is that instead of invading France from the west, from the seaside, let's say, would have essentially happened from the Meuse, from the right, that because Mons was further southeast than Villiers. Entrenchments had been built toward that direction, so they could have been, the Allies could have entered in France from the other side. So that's why it was so important. And there were some episodes in this approach that essentially put the Allies at severe risk, especially on September the 9th. There had been other movements that the Allies were at some point also besieging another minor center before Mons, and the French had already arrived, but they had still to organize. And Villiers wrote himself, "I cannot attack now because still I don't have enough force." But on the 9th, there was effective chance, if the French had pressed on, to basically annihilate the whole Marlborough army, that it was in terrible weather, and the Ally had probably not understood the French were there. And if the French had pressed on, the entire English contingent would have been taken out, and there would have been a clamorous French victory. The whole Allied invasion would have been aborted. Would have been a disaster. The reason why he didn't do that, and he preferred eventually to stand his ground at Malplaquet, was based on the ground of these this offensive deficiencies due to this kind of fear, of course, that is always there at any point from both sides, with a dramatic pressure, because the amount of men is enormous, right? And the reinforcements had arrived in the meanwhile, and supplies were still not so much. So the French realized that it was better at that point, rather than risking more, definitely in an attack, it would have been better to stand their ground, waiting for the Allies to essentially break through them, to attack them, and to essentially to exploit the advantages of defense, right? Even though leaving the initiative to the enemy. The Allies, of course, at that point they had to attack, because there was no way to take them on by besieging it while the French were at their throats, and by wiping out French resistance at that point, given they had left their own entrenched positions at La Bassette. It was an important opportunity. I mean, still a gamble like any single military operation possible, but considering the odds, it was something feasible. So this is strategically wise. Actually, the most the lost chances were mostly not from the Allies' side, right? I presume the question is more interested in the author of the question is more interested in the Allies' perspective. I don't know, but here it's rather the French that may have not exploited an important opportunity there on September the 9th. It's just that in practice we don't know really what the forces involved, morally speaking, and the state of supplies and so on would have actually reasonably motivated an attack at that point. Sure is, the Allies risked like hell at that point. So the battle went the way it did, as the same author says. We know it. We know what the battle was about. It was fundamentally this attempt of the Allies to break through the French position at Malplaquet. The French had partly entrenched. This is in fact a feature of the battle that, as we were saying in the beginning, showed this extremely bloody attacks on heavily entrenched positions. So a big deal of artillery fired was a bombardment of 7 hours against the French lines, and nevertheless the French maintained their cohesion. They were able even to counter-strike with cavalry. So the French had achieved their strategic aim. Fundamentally, they had managed to maintain the army was defeated, but was not routed. So this means that they had the Allies couldn't hope after the losses they had suffered, and in fact also the severe, as we will see now, debate that had arisen among them may fuel some idea of unexploited opportunity, but actually may seem very, very political in nature and very few to do with the actual military dimension that as it unfolded on the field, that properly broke their will to fight. They began at this point to bail out from the alliance, to seek a way out, and that was essentially what the French wanted. So, as always, as Clausewitz says, war is just a continuation of policy with other means, and the French achieved that. There was probably a sense of honor that the French here, of pride, properly, that they got from the battle, even though they had been formally beaten according to the rules of the time. And this was acknowledged immediately also by the Allies. So it was a big deal for the French army to finally, operate, tactically speaking, in a fashion that could counter even some, geniuses like Marlborough, Prince Eugene. Consider that Villiers had even outmarched Marlborough, which is something very, very rare in that context. So naturally, the French army was a first order army. It's just that these imposing problems, also properly putting all these soldiers together, feeding them, training them, motivating them, it was an enormous deal, right? So when the system, like with a huge famine and other, with this other moral burden from the previous defeats was hanging over them, was a would put the whole thing in a sort of crisis. And the allies that suffered the most were the Dutch, because they lost 9,000 men. The Dutch were there, as always, trying to save as much money and men as possible. And since, however, they weren't really the most important of the allies, were somewhat subordinated to the grand plans of Marlborough and Prince Eugene. And they in fact complained specifically that the disproportion between the 9,000 Dutch losses and the 1,800 British ones were due specifically to Marlborough deliberately, the deliberate sacrifice of the Dutch to save British lives. Right, and there was a debate here because these armies were enormous, right? And at the beginning of the battle, the White's forces fundamentally would have had to deploy on the Allied left flank, according to the battle plan as it had been sketched out and decided before. Right, instead they arrived in a rush. There is a source actually says that they even arrived fundamentally later on in the day, but they were deployed not on the left, but on the right at that point. So the Prince of Orange complained very much of this, and he said that if those forces had been deployed on his side, on his flank, he would have had sufficient troops to win against the French opposite flank, right? And this was actually countered as a narrative by British and Austrian commentators that pointed out how, according to the same plan, the Prince of Orange should have be in the battle somewhat exceeded his orders, right? He essentially attacked. He behaved very aggressively, attacking almost with recklessness, where his role by plan should have been just a diversionary attack, right? And as far as we understand, there is no way to determine what kind of difference such forces would have changed anything. We can understand the political grievance following from these things because of the broader relationship that existed between the allies, but we just don't have the evidence to determine whether things could have gone differently at that point. Given that there were also other important dynamics in the battle that cannot quite be that there are by themselves more impacting on the outcome, right? Some scholars go as far as saying that the Malplaquet was actually a French tactical victory, right? And it's not very distant from the truth, probably. The French especially made a very good use of cavalry that probably resulted in decisive saving the day. That tells for cavalry coming back very importantly on the Western European battlefields after the contraction of the previous centuries that just from actually half a century or more kept rising quite evidently within the military art. It was not a novelty, but the mass of such of the numbers was really important. The French horse managed to throw back the 30,000 Dutch, German, and British troopers that had been sent against them, right? And from the other side, Marlborough's plan was actually good, right? It even worked well, right? We don't have to think that somebody necessarily made a dramatic mistake. This is in fact my take on the battle, that especially from a tactical point of view, was actually fought very well. And that even here probably the main the main demerit doesn't even stand from the Allied side, right? The Marlborough had planned fundamentally the attacks on the flanks, on the French flanks, in order to cause Villars to weaken his center, right, and eventually exploiting the weakness in that sector. And if the Allied cavalry, especially, had managed to break through it, the French army would have probably been routed, and therefore Prince Eugene and Marlborough might have, been in Paris in a very short time, or at least, to bring France to a ignominious, peace, and with the radical changes in European history in the first place. So French cavalry there really, made a very good display, and consider that, as we were saying before, the French army had been bombarded for hours, right? And nevertheless, they managed to maintain their interior lines operating successfully, making good use of reserve, and so on, right? And without an Allied breakthrough, the Allies simply couldn't pursue the French army retreat in the first place. So there is actually, the Battle of Malplaquet shows again something that you couldn't really do much about, right? Marlborough coordination between cavalry and infantry was good, right? Was one of his specialties in the first place, and at Malplaquet, he didn't come less of the expectations. It's just that the French managed to parry the blow with their own cavalry, and that's it, right? Always remember this. This is something we explained many times in the Clausewitzian theory. When we look at big battles, right, the larger the battle, this is the rule, and the more even are the evenly balanced are the odds, right? So especially, and also, the larger the battle, the least option you have, right? So most of the times what really happens, of course, can depend on some things that can go wrong, or there may be a mistake or something like that, but generally speaking, in this situation, well, these forces clashed, and more or less it wasn't so strange that they managed to balance each other out in that regard, right? And it was actually at that point the concrete risk that the French cavalry counterattack may actually be able to break the Allied center in turn, and the Allies saved themselves because their infantry had occupied the abandoned Redon, and so the French were halted at that point. So attack, counterattack, blow, parrying, counter blow, counter parrying. It was good. They did well. Both sides did well. Artillery. At the Battle of Malplaquet, there is the first, let's say, it was the moment in which artillery played the most important role in military history up to that point, right? In a pitched battle, properly. Both sides had deployed mass batteries at key points, right, to coordinate with the other arms. And for example, Lotum attacked the French position in the woods with this grand, supported by a grand 40-gun battery. Right, it was a bath of blood from both sides. Right, because the French were there to receive, and it was a bath of blood in there, like a pure carnage. Also, the decimation of Dutch forces was due to the enfilading 20 French guns, right? That were, both batteries in this case were crucial for the success of the respective wings in this case. So such artillery tactics would have become a norm, in fact, after the Battle of Malplaquet, but up to that point, they were something new. And consider this, and that is to say, today we know how things went in the history of military art. At that point in history, nobody had ever done anything like that. Right? It's like blaming the War the First trench attacks, the blood of Verdun, and the complete and utter myth of the butchers, and all these things. People with reason like this have no idea what military history is. Like, properly, the history of the military art and the comparative and diachronic study of how armies were actually employed. right? And so there is no the success that such tactics enjoyed. Their first useful employment is remarkable in terms of the military cultures that had produced them and that knew how to employ them positively on the field, and that's quite of a display of civilization. Um, as I was saying before, most of the criticism actually could, the few criticism you can operate towards properly the tactical employment, maybe mostly from the French side actually, right? At least some later French historians came up with the idea that Villars may have won straight away, in a sense, if he had not entrenched so much of his infantry, especially on the right? And this, in fact, prevented Boufflers, the General Boufflers, from counterattacking the Dutch once they were butchered, in fact. And it was also difficult, like for internal lines, right, to move men from the right to the more hard-pressed left, right? And even about this, I presume that I mean, it may be true, but it's very difficult to measure it on the basis of the sources of the time. It's being pointed out that somebody that came later to the events, and therefore, maybe was just, I don't know. I should reconstruct the whole battle with all the sources. Something gigantic would take like a year or so, or I don't have the time for that. But that's one thing. The entrenchment naturally was functional to the French defense in the first place, and naturally the counterattack, the defense we know, we studied from Claude, is functional to the counterattack in the first place. So that may be a good criticism, but at the same time, we don't know whether necessarily the French would have managed to hold the Dutch attack in the first place if their infantry had been less entrenched, right? Just artillery didn't make things on its own, right? Always remember here that artillery, among the various arms, is the one that causes less casualties, right? It's mostly a psychological thing, but the first that comes from musketry fire, then from cavalry, and only from artillery, right? So that was quite important. And in a sense, yes, I mean, if the infantry had this counterattacking capacity increased, maybe they could have had it easier, even against the same Dutch on that side, and could have changed something. So as we were saying, the French retreated in good order, so the Allies were in no condition to pursue, and you can't really criticize them both for how things were handled, right? So the campaign eventually ended with Marlborough and Prince Eugene fell back to Blarigny. Boufflers dispersed the French army to reinforce towns and fortresses along the French frontier. The French managed even to slip 3 battalions through the Allied lines to reinforce the garrison of Mons. At that point, it was still under threat. So that, in fact, because Mons was how the campaign went on, right? The Allies kept besieging the town, and that was still defended by essentially the remnants of the Spanish, the forces of the Spanish Netherlands, and there was no attempt to relieve the town, right? Which held out until October the 20th, and that produced other 2,000 Allied casualties to his 700. So that defense was good, right? There was not much else to do concretely. And eventually, the bad season kicked in, and so it ended, right? And Villars said, "If God give us grace to lose such another battle, Your Majesty may reckon that your enemies are annihilated." Right. So that's right. It would be a Pyrrhic victory for the Allies in a sense. But it's something more, right? It's really it's something that was managed well, right? That was managed well because it was managed well by the both of them, and therefore that showed how resilient the French had been and how they were capable of maintaining, despite of their straight, let's say, control on their forces to operate skillfully and to stand their ground and to maintain good order in spite of all the supply problems and so on. And so I guess this is my brief take on the battle. Then we could talk about it again if we had to go in details, but I hope that this was enough. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.